American third parties are a somewhat infamous thing in this political landscape. While some European countries aren't as third parties as compared to others like the UK, overall, American third parties are infamous. Some accuse them of being a spoiler for an election, like how people say Al Gore would have won if it wasn't for Ralph Nader. That is untrue. While others say it is a waste of vote, that voting for a third party is ultimately like not voting at all. But the real question is, why in America third parties don't work? Is it because we're not a parliamentary system like the rest of Europe and Japan? Is it because we're first past the post like how the UK is in Canada? Is it because we're culturally not prepared for it? Or is it because of the media itself? I think all have a factor and more. First, we must ask, what were the original American parties that made up this nation in the beginning? What's important to note about America is that we are not a parliamentary system whatsoever. A parliamentary is when the legislation elects the executive. Famous parliaments include UK, Spain, Germany, Sweden, and Ireland, while America uses the presidential system. A presidential system is when the executive is voted independent of the legislation. Originally, when America became its own country, it tried to be a parliamentary system because that's where they originally came from. They had a prime minister called the President of Congress. You must remember, America wasn't splitting off from the UK and getting rid of everything they had known before. They were still Englishmen trying to do what did work. They still believed in the Magna Carta, which was influential into the ideas of private property and separation of powers, and John Locke, an Englishman who believed in the ideas of life, liberty, and pursuit of property. The Americans were keeping what worked and expanding what did and getting rid of what didn't. They ultimately believed the President of Congress needed to be elected independently of the legislation and by the people. America did not want to be dominated by political factions, so they decided that the president would be elected by the people. So a way to avoid the divisions that was political factions that was slowly raising through the UK and other places. We also use something called the electoral college, where depending on how many representatives are from a state, they shall get a certain amount of electoral votes. Now, this has caused some presidents to be elected without the majority approving him. Now, I am in favor of modifying the electoral college slightly, first using the Nebraska-Maine method, where if a congressional district votes for a candidate, majority-wise, that electoral vote shall go to the candidate. This does make a fairer and more representative election without completely dismantling the use of the electoral college. If we want a third-party candidate to become president, if we want that at all, then this is the best way to, along with disbanding the required amount of votes, instead of being the majority would suffice. But going back to the original question, what was the original parties? Well, at first, America used the Articles of Confederation, which made America more like a EU-style form of governance, and what did make the country weak. When the Constitution passed later and made the USA into a strong federation of states, there were many people who were unhappy. They were called the Anti-Federalists, or Democratic Republicans, or Jeffersonians. They often aligned with much of Thomas Jefferson's beliefs, specifically a weaker federal government. And what I mean by a strong and weak federal government within this time period's context, I mean by their standards. By our standards, Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party would be seen as a moderate libertarian party, and Thomas Jefferson's Anti-Federalist Party would be seen as an almost agricultural-based, extreme libertarian, near-anarchist party. If you want more details about the America's first election, I'd recommend the YouTube channel Postmodernist. It covers the first two elections, and it is quite fascinating about how much has changed and what has stayed the same. But to get back on topic, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were the two main parties, one for the Constitution and the presidency and one against it. The Anti-Federalists became known as the Democratic Republicans, while the Federalists died out during the War of 1812. Now, to be fair, there were 1.5 Federalist presidents George Washington, our first president, did align more with the Federalists than he did with the Anti-Federalists, and was able to solidify many things that definitely helped out the Federalists, like national taxes and the military. While John Adams was also a Federalist. And then Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a Jeffersonian, anti-Federalist, Democratic Republican, he did things that would be considered very Federalist, like starting West Point, one of the biggest military schools in the U.S. And he also purchased Louisiana, which is a very Federalist thing to do, but I digress from there. In 1824, the Democratic Republicans had a four-way election within their own party, all running for president. Due to the War of 1812, there was no strong Federalist party anymore. They practically died out, with an exception in the New England states. 1824 election causing no one to get a majority of 121 electoral votes. This caused Andrew Jackson did get the plurality of votes, but not the majority of votes. But ultimately, it had to go to the House, and the House decided it would be better for John Quincy Adams. Jackson called this a corrupt bargain, ultimately causing the split of the Democratic Republicans. Andrew Jackson, right after then, started the Democratic Party, the one that is still thriving today and is amongst possibly being the oldest surviving political party, along with the Conservative Party in the UK. Andrew Jackson's policies are very different from modern-day Democrats, obviously, and that's a side point, just want to clarify that. While the likes of Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams formed the National Republican Party, which is not connected to the Republican Party or the GOP of today. Two different things. They were sometimes referred to as the anti-Jacksonians. Soon, Henry Clay then started the Whig Party after the National Republican Party did not really work. The Whig Party also absorbed the Anti-Masonic Party, which was an anti-Freemason party. But then later, in the 1840s and 1850s, mostly in the 1850s, the Whig Party split over the issue of slavery. Much of the Whig Party in the North very much then became the Republican Party, which started out as an anti-slavery expansionist party. And then by 1860, Abraham Lincoln becomes the first Republican, GOP Republican, president of the United States, and the Civil War begins, very much solidifying these two political parties, Republicans and Democrats, as the mythological two parties of America. The Civil War causes them to be this ancient rivalry beyond all proportions, which I think is a major cultural factor with America. From 1860 to up until 1912, most elections, even if they did have a third-party candidate, it was mostly between the Democrats and Republicans, and always the Republicans winning out due to their immense popularity in the North, and they were seen as the war heroes. In 1912, William Howard Taft was the sitting president and the Republican nominee seeking re-election. Woodrow Wilson was the Democratic nominee from New Jersey, but was originally from Virginia. And then we have everyone's favorite president, Theodore Roosevelt, or T.D. Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt returned from his safari to find out that Taft had pretty much screwed up everything that TR had worked and done for in his previous terms. He thought of it as a betrayal of everything that he had stood for. This caused a split between the traditional Republicans and and Theodore Roosevelt's faction of the Republicans called the Progressive Party or Bull Moose Party. Now, to be fair, progressive is different from modern-day progressives. Progressives back then were just, hey, we shouldn't put kids in coal mines. Theodore Roosevelt ran a very successful campaign against Taft, winning more votes than Taft did, which would be the last time a third-party candidate won more national-wide votes than one of the two parties. But ultimately, this did cause Wilson to win, splitting the votes between the Republicans and the Progressives. This is probably why we think of third parties as spoilers, even though historically they've not been that much of a spoiler. The legacy of TR, good and bad, have cemented much of American history. While the Progressive Party did try to continue, it didn't help without TR's charisma. A few progressives did win governorships, like Robert La Follette. As time went on, and FDR became president and became the longest serving president of all time, probably the most famous Democratic president in U.S. history, that very much solidified the Democrats returning, having both Wilson, a Democrat, and FDR, a Democrat, be the ones who brought America through a bloody war and saved it and saved Europe, essentially did make the Democrats look like war heroes compared to how the Republicans used to look like in the American Civil War, solidifying the two parties once again as war heroes. In 1948, Strom Thurmond, along with Southern Democrats who thought the Democratic Party was becoming too progressive on race, so they started the States' Rights Democratic Party, which was a segregationist party. Thurmond even had 39 electoral votes, not as much as TR's 88 electoral votes, but still quite a bit. Then 10 years later, during the 1968 election, George Wallace ran for president as the American Independent Party, which is different from an independent, if that makes sense. He was a very staunch segregationist, although Wallace did have a good policy regarding Vietnam, which I recommend you researching. He received 46 electoral votes, being the last presidential election to have a third party win electoral votes legally. There were a few faithless electors throughout history afterwards, but this was a fully legal win. But what happened next? Well, the Libertarian Party was later formed in December 11th, 1971 in Colorado. The Libertarian Party is established with the ideologies of small governance, freedoms of speech, and the legality of bearing weapons, and a very complex relationship with the Constitution. While some loving it, some hating it, some criticizing it, it's very complicated, mostly due to it is both the giver of their rights and the framer of governance, which they're not very big fans of governance. So some see it as the best form of governance since it is so limited, while others seeing it as a curse. It's very complicated amongst libertarians. The party is also for economic liberalism. But this is the first misunderstanding of the party. Economic liberalism, you ask, isn't that socialism? No. It is not. Some people attribute modern-day socialist ideas from Bernie Sanders or AOC as liberal, because they are liberal on many things. And also leftists and liberal have become synonymous in swappy-rooies around with each other. But economic liberalism is simply laissez-faire capitalism. Liberalism just means accepting the ideas of allowing different ideas, or little to no government involvement in the economy, which economic liberalism being the latter. Libertarians are quite liberal in their views. They are in favor of prostitution, legalization of drug, and even some LGBTQ. Wait, said the viewer. I thought they were conservatives. This is another big misunderstanding. Libertarians are not conservatives, nor are conservatives libertarians. Libertarians are simply that, libertarians. While they do have overlaps with with conservatism, like 1A and 2A, many libertarians being former Republicans and even some libertarians being personally conservative. By definition, libertarians in their governance are economically capitalist and socially liberal. While there are many libertarians who are conservative, they are personally conservative. Now we have established that. We must acknowledge the fact that they haven't been super popular. They made it a few state houses, which is more impressive than some other parties. Arguably, the 2016 election was actually a really good year for them because they were able to get some media attention and possibility of election. Now, of course, they didn't win it, but it was pretty good on them. They could have pushed it if they had a stronger media presence. Right? The Green Party. The Green Party was established in 1984 as a progressive, environmentally friendly political party that became increasingly more socialist as time went on. They famously ran in the 2000 election with Ralph Nader, causing people to accuse it of being a spoiler party. It wasn't. But this did cause something interesting. The party caused the average public person to think to be environmentally friendly means to be left-wing. Environmentally involved does not mean left-wing inherently. There are ideas of right-wing environmentalism. A famous conservative American that was environmentalist was actually Richard Nixon. He established the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which of course is controversial, but it does establish that environmentalism is a broader bipartisan issue, but for some reason has been mostly adopted by the left. While the Green Party is the lesser of the two compared to libertarians, it is still the most notable for a few reasons. My home state of Washington very much loves the Green Party over libertarians, and even some Republicans on a city level. I know Seattle has had many, many Green Party candidates compared to Republican candidates. Also, in Europe, the libertarianism isn't really a thing. You do have like liberal Democrats and that type of stuff who used to be kind of economically laissez-faire. I don't know about anymore. But libertarianism is mostly an American thing with British influence. The Green Party is still incredibly popular throughout Europe compared to libertarianism. In fact, however, the Green Party has also done stuff in Germany like outlawing nuclear energy, which is very, very dumb. 1992. In 1992, Republican President George H.W. Bush was running for president, and Democratic nominee and governor of Arkansas was running against him. Both agreed on one particular issue, and that was NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association. It was to be believed that it would prosper free trade between Canada, USA, and Mexico. But one man, a billionaire in Texas, thought it would lose American jobs and ship them off to Mexico. This man was Ross Perot. Ross Perot had a mix of beliefs, while economically conservative, open to some gun restrictions, strong borders protecting U.S. from Mexico and Japan, and universal health care, to a degree along with electoral reform. He also believed the one flaw of the Founding Fathers, that they were born before the Industrial Revolution really started to kick off, which is partly true, and that they could not have seen the strong arm of the American corporations. Perot famously said in one debate with Bush and Clinton that he was the only candidate not backed by foreign money, which honestly is such a big deal nowadays. He was also quite socially liberal in some things and socially conservative with others. Ultimately, he won 18% of the popular vote but no state electoral votes. Then in 1995, after a debate on Larry King with Vice President Al Gore, Ross Perot decided to form the Reform Party, which was a mix of his ideas, but after the loss of 1996, it became a hodgepodge of all ideas and kind of becoming slightly going back to Ross Perot's ideals in more recent years. In the 2000 election, Donald J. Trump, yep, that guy, yes, the president, the future president, not president then, but future president in 2016 and now, actually tried to run as the Reform Party candidate, but he dropped out after the race officially began. In fact, Trump talks about what he would do as president as a Reform Party candidate in his book, The America We Deserve, which was written in 1999, right before the 2000 election. If you want to know more about the reform, how he would have run as a Reform candidate, I'd probably recommend that. I'm about to read the book myself relatively soon. Now, what is interesting is Jesse Ventura is the only member of the Reform Party to actually be elected to governor, although his reputation is quite controversial nowadays. And the Reform Party, while still alive, isn't what it used to be or could have been. But they did nominate RFK Jr. as their candidate, which RFK Jr. did much better than Jill Stein did in my home state of Washington, which is kind of a big deal. The American Solidarity Party, or Christian Democratic Union Party. Christianity is one of the most influential and important religions on earth. Even atheists cannot deny how it has impacted the world, especially when it comes to politics. Now, both America and Britain have had an interesting thing in common. Despite both being some of the most powerful Christian nations that have existed on earth, they don't or never had powerful Christian political parties like Germany or the Netherlands, etc. But why is this? For the UK, the king is the defender of the faith and head of state and the head of the church, kind of. Why would you need a Christian political party when everyone that is part of some political party is supposed to swear allegiance to the one who defends the faith? It seems counterintuitive in some ways. With America, it could be that with the idea of freedom of religion, not to say America hasn't been influenced by religion, it has to a degree. especially when it came to the abolition of slavery, the biggest influence that religion has held in America was the act of prohibition. Prohibition was very much a religious action, banning alcohol to prevent sin. Of course, prohibition made America worse and more sinful. Now you might be thinking, isn't this supposed to be about political parties? Why are we talking about prohibition and Christianity? What does this have to do with third parties? Well, the American Solidarity Party, which is America's recent Christian party. In 2011, inspired by parties in Latin and mainland Europe, a group of Christians decided to form the American Solidarity Party, a socially conservative, pro-life, pro-environment, pro-family, pro-social safety net, and the closest to distributism that America has, and are in favor of electoral reform. It has been the most outspoken against both parties vigorously, more so than the Libertarians, arguably, or even Greens. They are amongst the newest of the parties and are the fastest growing party in America. They're even running someone in Texas State House, which is a wise decision. The best way for a third party to achieve anything of notoriety is by winning local elections. If I was a betting man, the ASP, American Solidarity Party, is probably the best option for a successful third party. It is very growing fast despite it being much smaller. It's starting to really grow. If they focus on small local elections before heading up onto the federal level, they could be really a party of reckoning and forcefulness. But this does bring me into someone else, and that is Elon Musk. Elon Musk and Donald J. Trump recently broke up. Elon Musk has now wanted to start a new political party, the American Party, TAP, which is a fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Hey, isn't this just the Libertarians and some of the Reform Party members? Not quite. Elon's The American Party does want a focus on improving military and non-military technologies. It's kind of like Libertarians with cyberpunk, which is kind of cool when you think about it, but also checks out with Elon Musk. Think about that. That bro's a nerd. And he has stated that he simply wants to garner seats from the House and Senate and not the presidency. While definitely the most intelligent idea I've heard the man speak, I still think this is aiming way too high. You still have to start statewide. Now, I do think with Elon Musk, he could probably go with like the bigger states like New York, Florida, or Texas. He doesn't need us to try to hit out at the small states, arguably. So that is something I'll note. So yes, very much, if you want to run a successful third party, you have to start at the lowest house. Most likely state. If not state, then city. If not city, then, well, I don't know. Just go with city, then state, then federal. But I do think Elon Musk's The American Party and the American Solidarity Party have a very high chance of becoming very prevalent in the future. Why is the U.S. currently a two-party state system? It is in partly due to the idea of seeking the presidency instead of local governments. But another issue is that what could cause a successful third party? So perhaps for a new party to emerge from the ashes of the two parties, there needs a massive issue that splits one of the two parties. But if one of the two parties split, which one? On one hand, the Democrats are at a loss currently. They have no strong leader or candidate for the presidency as of 2025. This could change. Without a strong leader, it could be really easy to splinter. I could see Democrats being split in the Green Party, absorbing the more radical, while the moderates flock to the Republican Party, causing the Republican Party to become even more liberal and moderate than it has already been. However, I don't think that's how it will happen. In fact, I think the Republican Party will split, and it is more likely, due to Trump's influence and his policies and his takes. Trump can't be denied as a charismatic figure and polarizing figure in American politics. However, arguably, his views on abortion is arguably the most controversial of his views, being very moderate compared to most Republican politicians. However, I see once Trump's done with his time as presidency, abortion is going to splinter the Republicans. But I don't think it will be as simple as a half-half split. I see it in four ways. The pro-choice MAGA, who want to continue Trump's policies, and I think Trump's policies as is, and it's very much aesthetic. And then I could also see a pro-life MAGA, which very much continuing the aesthetic in some of his policies of MAGA, but denouncing the abortion parts. Then I would also say there will be a new GOP, which would be a much more conservative Republican Party than MAGA. It wouldn't necessarily be a retreatist or a reactionary, but just a continual spark of conservatism that MAGA has failed. Because MAGA isn't as conservative as the past has been in some things. Just think of homosexuality and abortion are very moderate in the Republican Party compared to the past. Trump has been the most pro-LGBTQ president that, at least Republican president, or even president in general, compared to the likes of Obama and Clinton and Bush's. I could see in the not-so-distant future infighting within the GOP that could really splinter off. It is just a theory, but I'd love to hear what you guys think. Is there going to be a massive splintering, But with all this said, is that all? Is the USA doomed to forever be a two-party system? No, there are ideas on how to improve the proof. First, I reject the idea that we need to become a parliamentary republic. That would cause a major constitutional change. Now, there is an idea of if a party gets 10% of a vote, it gets one seat. I believe this is called proportional representation. I'm hesitant about adding this to the federal Congress, but state Congress would be interesting to see this experiment take place. Now, at least not on a state level, I think we would see maybe one day, if third parties were strategic, a form of multi-party system on a state level, which does bring into another idea. The European Union has these things called political groupings, which is a group of multiple political parties smashed together. In the EU, there are multiple national parties, the French conservatives, Spanish conservatives, and German conservatives, just for a broad example. I know these aren't their names, but bear with me. But once they are elected into the EU Parliament, they're considered those parties, but are grouped into a conservative group that is filled with different European conservative parties. If you want further detail, I'd recommend watching TLDR EU's Parliamentary Explained video. With that now I explained, I can imagine if all states had multiple different types of parties, I could see that happening. And once federal election comes around, it would either be a multi-party Congress or an EU-style political grouping, still with two political parties, now just filled with more clearly differentiating factions that have official names from their state. Or America just remains a two-party state. I don't know. There can be many ideas, as you can see, and listen to some of my advice and how we should focus on state than federal. I didn't even mention all the parties like Socialist, Constitution, and the Forward Party. This was just a brief summary of thoughts and opinions. Ultimately, if you want a third party to be successful, go statewide, not nationwide. And hopefully, you really enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, God bless.